So the last video ended on a bit of a downer, with me sharing my immediate thoughts following a fairly disappointing result. I mentioned that I need to make some changes, and while there are a few things that I can point to that may explain some of the discrepancy between my best time and that performance, 2 minutes in a 10k is a lot to explain away. And if I'm being totally honest with myself, I know that I'm not as fit as I was 6 months ago. Despite incrementally increasing my training load and consistently running upwards of 135 kilometers a week, I haven't made any fitness gains in that time. I track all of my sub-T paces and keep a record of the data, along with heart rate as a control, and you can see that I had a significant improvement in the first 10 weeks of adopting the Norwegian singles method, but those paces haven't improved in the last 6 months. In addition, while I've run personal bests at 5k and the marathon in that time, none of my race performances have equaled or better my 10k best of 32:24 from July of last year. And in fact, many of my recent races have paled in comparison to that performance. Now, I did a short marathon block in that period, which will obviously detract from the cumulative training effect that the Norwegian singles method is trying to achieve, but that was a total of 5 weeks out of the past 29 weeks. And those 5 weeks still consisted of one traditional sub-T workout along with a bigger marathon-specific workout, which technically speaking was still sub-threshold. I could also point to the idea that I've raced more frequently recently, which may have disrupted my training, but that's not strictly true. I've raced 5 times in the past 16 weeks, which isn't out of line with the frequency I usually race. And in the past, I've raced far more frequently and still managed to progress my performances. I could also put it down to dealing with a niggle in my adductor and lower abdominals. Whenever managing pain, it takes a bit of the fun out of training and you just lose a bit of the magic. However, this also isn't unusual. I can honestly say that over the past 4 years, I've dealt with some sort of niggle for roughly 90% of that time. Some have been worse than others, but they've been there nonetheless. When I ran my 10k PB, I was dealing with a foot issue that for a brief period I suspected was a stress fracture. And then when I ran my marathon PB, I was dealing with a groin issue, which I discussed in episode 11. Then there's a possibility that I could have low iron or some other deficiency brought on by a relatively high training load. I'm yet to rule that out. I booked a blood test and it'll be interesting to see the results. But personally, I don't think that's it. I haven't really talked about diet on this channel, and there's good reason for that. Along with politics and religion, diet seems to be one of those extremely divisive topics. But I'll just say this. I think my diet is pretty good. I avoid ultra-processed food as much as possible. I cook all of my own meals. I eat lots of different fruits, seeds, nuts, and vegetables. And I just eat a ton of food overall. Personally, I've never understood how people can undereat. It's never been the issue for me. It's always been the opposite. I mean, come on. Do you not like food? How can you undereat? But anyway, there's also the fact that I ran in shoes that may not have been as fast as the ones I typically wear. That's something that can't be ignored completely, but even with that and all of the other things I've mentioned in combination, that doesn't really explain a 2-minute regression over a 10k. So if I'm not getting fitter and faster, what do I need to do? Well, I've got to change my training. I've had 3 big jumps in fitness over the past 4 years, and they've all come as a result of taking a risk and doing something different. At first it was heavily cross-training, and then it was doing double threshold, and then finally adopting Norwegian singles. But with all 3, there's been a point where the returns have dried up and I've needed to switch to something else. Now, there's no fully formed system that I can simply adopt, so I'm going to have to rely on my intuition and what I think I need at this point in time. I've been heavily training my threshold, doing 2, 3, sometimes 4 threshold sessions a week over the past 18 months, and so I suspect I've simply tapped out that intensity domain for the time being. I speculate that this is no longer my limiting factor, but rather my anaerobic system has diminished to the point where it's bringing the ceiling down on paces above the anaerobic threshold, which in turn is preventing my anaerobic threshold from improving. Now, this may never be an issue for some runners, and it's very likely that if you're only running 5 to 8 hours a week, the benefits of the Norwegian singles system greatly outweighs any loss incurred to the anaerobic system. However, based on how I felt in 3k, 5k and 10k races recently, I think that this is my issue. Even in the races where I've run well, I've felt flat out from the start, which makes racing a bit of a torture fest. And look, I could put up with this if every race did go well. Ultimately, my main priority is performance. But when 3 of the last 4 races I've done at events 10k or less have been way off my best, then it becomes a little less tolerable. So anyway, that's a long spiel, and so I guess I should explain what I'm going to do differently. Well, I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm still going to do quite a bit of threshold training and stick fairly closely to my current structure, but for the next 8 weeks, what I'm going to do is sub out one of my weekly sub-threshold workouts and replace it with something shorter and faster. To be clear, I won't be doing traditional VO2 max workouts like 5x1k at 5k pace off 2 minutes recovery. Instead, I'll be trying shorter reps in higher volume to still get the biomechanical stimulus of running at a much faster pace, while also performing a lot more overall work at this intensity. In addition, I won't be bound by heart rate in these workouts. I'll be aiming to remain controlled, but the aim will be to push above LT2 into what some call the super threshold or critical velocity domain, essentially getting my heart rate to peak in the range of 90 to 95% of max. Now, an example workout is the one I did last week. It was 4 sets of 5 by 400 meters. I took 30 seconds recovery between reps and 1 minute recovery between sets. The first 3 sets were done at 10k effort, and the last set was done at 3 to 5k effort. And my heart rate maxed at 171 BPM, which is 93.5% of max. And this was probably the most enjoyable workout I've done in months. It was nice to not be constantly looking at my watch, trying to keep myself from going above my LT2 heart rate. This week I'll be doing something slightly different. I'll start with 6x1k, starting at half marathon pace and moving down to 10k pace, all off 60 seconds recovery. And then I'll jog over to a hill and run 10 by 30 seconds at a controlled effort, something around 1500 meter effort with a jog back down recovery. Now, adding in higher intensity work will obviously come with some additional risk, and my plan is to accommodate this by slightly reducing the volume of these workouts and by backing off the intensity of one of my other workouts each week. That'll be the 3x3k, which I'll perform at marathon effort rather than sub-threshold, which is roughly a difference of 5 to 10 seconds a kilometre. My overall volume will also be fractionally lower. These changes may not fully account for the increase in stress, but that's a risk I'll just have to manage. So you might be thinking, aren't you kind of going back on everything you've said before about training? And the answer to that is, in some ways yes, but in other ways no. I still think for people running 5 to 8 hours a week, Norwegian singles is probably the best way to develop your aerobic system for the hours you have available to you. And that's going to translate into better performances than the more traditional approach. But that's not the position I'm currently in. And look, when everything's going well in running, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking you've found the secret and improvement is just a matter of stringing weeks together. I admit, I'm guilty of this. But when the training you're doing stops working, then you have to come to terms with that and not be so rigid in your thinking. Ultimately, I'm concerned with running faster first and foremost, and that means I'm not beholden to one philosophy. But anyway, that's my short-term plan. The other part of my plan is longer term, and that involves periodizing my training once again. One of the big components of Norwegian singles is that there is no periodization. It's all about simply stacking and increasing training load over time. Again, I think this is very effective for people who are doing 5 to 8 hours of running a week. But as the training load becomes greater, it appears that so too does the need for periodization. Now, I don't know that for sure, and perhaps it isn't the case for everyone, but it seems to be the case for me. As I mentioned earlier, each big jump in performance has come following a change to the structure or the targeted intensity of my training. And so what I intend to do in the future is to cycle through different periods of training. Each period will be 8 to 12 weeks long and will have a different focus. So this period will be a super threshold or critical velocity focus. The next may be a marathon block, and the one after that may be a double threshold block. And then maybe I'll switch back to a standard Norwegian singles block. I haven't locked anything in just yet, but upon reflection, this more dynamic approach has worked pretty well in the past, and so I'm eager to try it out again. So that's my plan. I don't know if it's going to work. I may get slower and slower, but I have to try something. I know that some people will disagree and think that I should persevere, but to me, if you haven't improved in 6 months, then that's a long enough period to know that you're not on the right track, and something needs to change, even if it's just a small tweak. And look, the uncertainty of training is frustrating, but experimenting can also be part of the fun. Anyway, I've waffled on for long enough. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.